Only 4 people in this world knew about the third step. My wife and our 2 children were the only ones who knew. It was the house's quietest secret, a familiar flaw we never fixed. So, when the stranger at our Christmas Eve table mentioned it, the world tilted. My name is Mark, a 48-year-old history teacher used to quiet foundations. My wife, Sarah, had invited this man from her church's outreach program. His name was Leo, and he sat with a stillness that absorbed the room's warmth. Our teenage kids offered him polite, brief answers, and then disappeared into their phones. I watched Leo over my wine glass, feeling an unexplainable sense of unease. He ate his pecan pie slowly, his gaze drifting around the room. He told us that our old house had a good, solid feel to it. Then he looked toward the back hallway with a faint, knowing smile. He said that you always knew when someone was coming for a visit. You just had to listen for the squeak on that third back stair. A cold silence fell over me that no one else seemed to notice. It was a secret kept by the floorboards of the home I grew up in. I stared at him, but his expression was perfectly unreadable. The festive carols playing in the other room suddenly felt hollow. The perfect family Christmas I cherished had just been fractured by his words. This man was a complete stranger who knew our home's most intimate detail. Something was deeply wrong, and Sarah had invited it in for dessert. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of my own forced smiles. I kept searching his face for a clue, any sign of his intent. He offered nothing, retreating into his calm and observant silence. Our cozy holiday felt like a fragile stage set about to collapse, and this quiet stranger was now standing calmly in the wings. I felt my hands begin to tremble as I started clearing the plates. His comment was too small for a guess and too specific for a coincidence. Christmas morning was meant to wash away any strange feelings. The air should have smelled only of pine needles and brewing coffee. Sarah always turned the holidays into a flawless, grand production. Her charity work was the centerpiece of her seasonal identity. Inviting a lonely person from the church was a natural act for her. I tried to see Leo's comment as a simple, bizarre coincidence. Lonely people sometimes notice small details that others easily miss. I repeated this mantra to myself while the kids opened their gifts. My father had also believed in the importance of appearances. He was a respected local businessman who built our family's name. He taught me that a solid reputation was worth almost everything, yet he always seemed a bit distant during the holiday season. His smile never quite reached his eyes in our old family photos. It was a private observation I had never once spoken out loud. I remembered his strange, intense dislike of the backyard blue jays. He used to say they were nothing but thieves in pretty feathers. It was just a small, peculiar detail about a well-regarded man. I pushed the memory aside and focused on my daughter's new book. We were a normal family, having a perfectly normal Christmas morning, but the sound of the third step echoed quietly in my mind. Every time one of the kids ran upstairs, I would slightly flinch. The house's secret was no longer a charming little family quirk. A stranger's words had managed to poison that simple comfort. I looked at my family, so happy and completely unaware of my dread. This perfect morning felt like a carefully constructed and fragile lie. The silence in my head was louder than all the festive music. I just wanted to get through the day without falling apart. The foundation of my world felt like it had developed a crack. Everything looked the same, but I knew it was different now. The big Christmas dinner was held at our house that evening. My mother arrived, her arms full of presents and side dishes. Leo was quiet, sitting between my son and my daughter. The conversation was light, focused on weather and local news. Sarah asked Leo about his childhood Christmases, trying to be kind. He spoke of a small, simple house with a big maple tree. He mentioned a bird feeder his father had built in the yard. He described feeding the bright blue jays that came every winter. He said his father called them the jewels of the backyard. A cold, familiar tension rose from the pit of my stomach. My own father had despised blue jays with a burning passion. He built special baffles to keep them away from other birds. He called them loud, aggressive, and greedy feathered thieves. I glanced across the table at my mother, expecting her to laugh. I thought she would correct this stranger's odd, mistaken story, but she was not laughing, and her face was completely pale. Her fork was frozen in her hand just above her dinner plate. She stared at Leo with an expression of pure, unfiltered shock. In that moment, the entire illusion of our family history cracked. Nobody else at the table seemed to notice what had just happened. The cheerful holiday chatter continued on around our silent crisis. My mother quickly recovered and took a small sip of her water. But I had seen her face, and I could not unsee it. The man at our table was not just a random stranger anymore. He was somehow connected to a secret my mother was keeping. My own memories felt suddenly unreliable and thin like old paper. I began to doubt the very ground beneath my feet. The festive dinner now tasted like absolute ashes in my mouth. After everyone left, the house was filled with a tense silence. I waited until the kids were asleep before I spoke to Sarah. I described the story Leo told about feeding the blue jays. I explained the shocking, pale expression on my mother's face. I desperately needed her to tell me that I was not crazy. Sarah just sighed and started gathering the empty wrapping paper. She told me I was reading too much into a simple coincidence. She said I was being unkind to a lonely man on Christmas. Her words were calm, but they felt like a quiet accusation. She accused me of trying to find drama where there was none. She just wanted to preserve her perfect holiday, and I was threatening it. I went to bed that night feeling completely and utterly alone. The next morning I decided to call my mother directly. I asked her about her reaction to the stranger's dinner story. A cold, defensive wall immediately went up in her voice. She told me she had no idea what I was talking about. She claimed she was just tired from all the holiday preparations. She warned me not to spoil our family memories with my paranoia. Her denial was absolute, leaving no room for any more questions. I was now stranded on an island of my own suspicion. My wife thought I was being cruel. My mother thought I was crazy. I started to wonder if they were somehow right about me. Maybe I had imagined the flicker of fear in my mother's eyes. A heavy, misplaced guilt began to settle deep within my chest. I felt ashamed for disrupting our family's fragile sense of peace. My certainty was eroding, replaced by a confusing and isolating fog. A few quiet, heavy days passed after the Christmas holiday. I was putting old decorations away in the dusty attic space. I found a cardboard box of my mother's forgotten photo albums. I sat on an old trunk and began flipping through the pages. There were countless faded pictures of my childhood in the 70s. One photo showed my father standing proudly by his prize rose bushes. Behind him, near the old oak tree, stood a small young boy. The child was partially hidden in the long afternoon tree shadows, but his eyes were clear, looking directly toward the camera. I felt my breath catch sharply in the back of my throat. They were Leo's eyes, filled with that same quiet watchfulness. Later that day, Sarah found a pair of worn gloves on the entryway table. She said they must belong to Leo, our holiday charity guest. As I went to put them away, I felt something hard inside. I pulled out a single old-fashioned key made of brass. It was a type of key I had never seen before in my life. A sudden and chilling idea began to form in my mind. I went down to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. My father's old office had been locked for over a decade. We never opened it after he died, preserving it like a tomb. My hand was shaking as I approached the old wooden door. I pushed the brass key from the glove into the dusty keyhole. I slowly turned my wrist, expecting it to jam or resist, but it turned smoothly and ended with a definitive click. The lock on my father's secret room was now finally open. I pushed the old wooden door open, and it groaned loudly. A wave of cold, stale air washed over me from the darkness. It was the smell of sealed-off time, of dust and old paper. The only light came from the bare bulb in the basement hallway. It cast a long, pale rectangle onto the office floor. I stepped inside, my shoes making soft sounds on the dusty floorboards. Everything was exactly as I remembered it from more than a decade ago. My father's heavy oak desk stood like a monument in the center. His tall leather chair was tucked neatly beneath it, waiting for him. The bookshelves were filled with imposing volumes he had never read. This room was a carefully constructed image of a serious, intellectual man. It was the image he had sold to our family and the entire world. For a moment, I felt like a trespasser in a sacred, holy space. My own confusion felt like a desecration of his memory. Then I remembered the key and the boy's eyes in the old photograph. I did not know what I was even looking for in this place. I ran my hand over the dusty surface of the massive desk. I pulled at the handle of the large central drawer. It was stuck at first, but then opened with a wooden shriek. The drawer was mostly empty, containing only dried-up pens and paper clips, but in the back there was a simple cardboard box without any label. It looked completely out of place among the mahogany and leather. I lifted the box out and placed it carefully on the desk. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm inside my chest. I lifted the lid and looked inside at the contents. The first thing I saw was a thick stack of photographs. I saw my father smiling with a woman I had never seen before. In another, he was pushing a small boy on a swing set. The boy was Leo, and my father looked happier than I ever saw him. There were pictures of birthdays, picnics, and simple summer afternoons. It was a whole life I never knew, captured on faded film. Beneath the pictures were bundles of letters tied with old string. They were love letters from the other woman, full of shared secrets. She wrote about Leo's first day of school and his fear of thunderstorms. She wrote about her loneliness and her hope for their future. It was the complete story of my father's other hidden family. At the very bottom of the box, I found a child's drawing. It was a crayon picture of a tall man holding a little boy's hand. The man had my father's dark hair and wide, familiar shoulders. In the corner, in a messy script, was a single name, Leo. I sat on the cold floor of that dark, forgotten room. The man I had spent my entire life admiring was a complete stranger. He was not a pillar of the community, but a careful, meticulous liar. The foundation of my life, the history I taught, was all a fraud. There was no anger yet, only a vast and hollow emptiness. My father was a ghost who had haunted the wrong family. I did not put the box back in the dark, dusty drawer. I carried it upstairs with me, holding it like a bomb. The truth felt heavy and dangerous in my trembling hands. I drove to my mother's house in a complete, cold silence. The radio was off, and the world outside the car was a blur. She was surprised to see me, offering me coffee and leftovers. I refused her hospitality and placed the box on her coffee table. I did not have to say a single word to her. I simply lifted the lid for her to see inside. She looked at the photos of the other woman and the little boy. There was no shock on her face, only a deep, weary resignation. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She told me she had known about the affair for almost 40 years. She explained that she made a practical choice to ignore it. My father was a good provider who gave her a comfortable life. She said she was not willing to lose her home and her friends. She chose stability for us over some messy, inconvenient, emotional truth. Her voice was not sad, just pragmatic and strangely distant. She spoke of the lie as if it were a household budget. She showed no remorse for the decades of painful, calculated deception. She was more concerned that I had found this uncomfortable secret. It was the disruption of the peace that bothered her, not the lie itself. I looked at the woman who raised me, and I saw a stranger. Her indifference to my pain was a betrayal far worse than my father's. His lies were in the past, but hers were here and now. I left her house without another word and drove back home. I showed Sarah the pictures and explained the letters to her. She was horrified by my mother's cold and selfish confession, but her concern felt directed at the drama of the situation. She did not seem to understand the foundation of my world was gone. She saw a problem to be managed, a difficult family crisis. I saw the complete and total annihilation of my own history. In a single day, I had lost both of my parents. One was lost to a box of lies, the other to the truth. The hollowness inside me began to change over the next few days. It was no longer a simple emptiness, but a cold, hard vacuum. I stopped looking for answers or waiting for some kind of apology. My mother's pragmatic silence had killed any hope for that. I realized that understanding was a fool's goal, a useless luxury. The only thing left to do was to reclaim the story itself. The narrative of the perfect family had been a lie I inherited. Now I would be the one to finally write the ending. My father's carefully constructed legacy was a monument to his deception. I decided I would be the one to tear it down, stone by stone. I was no longer interested in mourning the man I thought he was. I was only interested in exposing the man he actually had been. My first step was quiet, deliberate, and carefully planned. I needed to find Leo, the living proof of my father's secret. I went through the church directory Sarah kept on her desk. It felt wrong to use her well-meaning charity records for this, but my sense of right and wrong had been completely burned away. I found his name and a simple phone number listed there. I stared at the number for a long time. the engine of my plan. This was not about anger or seeking some kind of brotherly connection. This was a strategic move, like moving a piece on a chessboard. I finally dialed the number, my hand steady and my heart cold. He answered on the second ring, his voice as quiet as I remembered. I told him my name and that I was the man from Christmas dinner. I said that I had found our father's old office. I mentioned the box of letters and the stacks of photographs. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I did not fill it with accusations or with my own pain. I simply waited for him to process the information I gave him. He finally said he had wondered if this day would ever come. I told him we needed to meet and talk about our shared history. It was not a request, but a simple statement of fact. My grief was gone, replaced by a cold and clear sense of purpose. We met in a quiet coffee shop on the other side of town. Leo looked older and more tired in the harsh fluorescent light. We were two strangers connected only by a dead man's profound lies. I did not buy us any coffee, keeping the meeting strictly business. I slid a small selection of photos and letters across the table. He looked at them with a sad, familiar recognition in his eyes. He told me his mother had loved my father until the day she died. He spoke of a childhood spent waiting for a man who never fully arrived. There was no anger between us, only the shared wreckage of a life. I then explained to him my plan, my voice low and even. I was not interested in money or a public messy scandal. I was interested in correcting the historical record with surgical precision. My first meeting was with my father's old business partner. He was a man who still told stories of my father's integrity. I showed him a photo of Leo's mother and a single dated letter. The man's face collapsed as he read the undeniable, painful truth. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep horror. A week later, I met with the head of a local charity board. My father's name was carved in granite in the hospital lobby. I presented her with the same cold, irrefutable evidence of his secret. I told her the name on her wall belonged to a liar. I suggested that honoring him was an insult to the community. The consequences of my actions began to ripple back to me. My mother called me, her voice shaking with a desperate fury. She said I was dragging our family name through the mud. She accused me of being hateful and cruel, bent on total destruction. She begged me to stop this campaign, to think of our family. I told her that our family was a fiction that had already been destroyed. I felt nothing but ice in my veins. As I listened to her plead, I was fully committed to this path, unable to turn back now. The tension was no longer just inside my head, it was real. The town's annual Founders' Day ceremony was the perfect stage. My father was scheduled to receive a posthumous award for his charity. The town's most respected citizens were all gathered in the auditorium. They were there to celebrate a history they thought they knew. I sat in the front row between my mother and a bewildered Sarah. My mother had not spoken to me in weeks before this. She was here now only to preserve the last shred of appearances. Leo sat a few rows behind us, a quiet and anonymous guest. He had agreed to my final plan without any hesitation. When the announcer called my father's name, my mother started to stand. I put a gentle hand on her arm, keeping her in her seat. I walked up to the podium alone, into the bright, warm spotlight. The mayor tried to hand me the heavy engraved glass plaque. I did not take the award from his outstretched hands. I told the audience I could not accept it on my father's behalf. I explained there was someone else with a greater claim to his legacy. I turned and gestured to the back of the auditorium. I introduced the crowd to my brother, Leo, and invited him to speak. A confused murmur rippled through the silent, watching crowd. Leo walked to the stage, his steps steady and his face calm. He did not speak with anger or with any self-pity. He just told his simple story of a father he barely knew. He spoke of weekend visits and a bird feeder in a backyard. His quiet, dignified truth was more powerful than any loud accusation. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, crushing weight. The mayor and the committee members on stage looked utterly horrified. The public honor was rescinded right there in a humiliating whisper. The ceremony was ruined, and my father's name was destroyed. It was not a victory, just a final, definitive correction of the record. The town quickly found a new scandal to whisper about. My father's name simply faded from plaques and from conversations. My mother and I do not speak to each other anymore. Sometimes I see her car driving on the other side of town. We are now just two strangers who share a bitter history. My marriage to Sarah exists only as a matter of routine. We live in the same house, but in different, silent worlds. She looks at me with a quiet disappointment she no longer hides. She will never understand why I chose demolition over quiet dignity. She thinks I broke our family, but I know I only revealed it. I see Leo sometimes in the grocery store or at the gas station. We never speak or even acknowledge each other with a nod. We are two halves of a secret that is no longer a secret. We have nothing left that connects us, not even our shared pain. I did not find a new family or a sense of true belonging. I simply traded a comfortable, well-decorated lie for an empty room. The house feels different now, haunted by the truth I unearthed. It is no longer a home, just a collection of tainted memories. I spend a lot of time alone in my father's old office. I sit in the dark and try to feel something, but there is nothing. My whole life was built on a story that was not true. Now, there is no story at all, only this hollow quiet. Sometimes one of the kids will run up the back staircase. I hear the familiar squeak of the third step, the sound that started it all. It is no longer a charming quirk, but a constant, painful reminder. It is the sound of a ghost who still lives here. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.